Hey there, everybody. Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and this week I had a really great question in one of our student Q&A sessions. A student from Africa was reaching out and asking some questions about, how do we start to fit herbs into kind of our Western model of understanding them when that information isn't readily available, right? A student being from Africa, there's lots of local medicinal plants there that you can't necessarily go to your typical materia medica reference book and look them up in a book. But if one is studying Western herbalism, it's really helpful to understand your plants in terms of, their medicinal actions, their energetics, their organ system affinities, etc. So where do you start, right? How do you figure that stuff out? So that's what this week's post is all about, is really looking into how do you start to decipher the properties of a medicinal plant when you're starting from scratch, when you can't look that herb up in a book, when maybe even you don't have any teachers to turn to or local references or traditional people that have used that plant in that culture for a long time. How do you start to understand how to use those plants? Well, that's what this week's post is all about. I've got a really nice framework laid out for how you can start to approach a medicinal plant that maybe you don't know or that you can't look up and reference, and how to start to build your experiential knowledge and understanding of that medicinal plant. So hope you enjoy this week's episode here on the channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Question number 1 is coming from Titilayo Fashola in the Vitalist Herbal Practitioner Program. And her question is, I have learned the roles that Western herbs can take in formulation, but I live in Africa where we have so many weeds that have been used over centuries by the locals without understanding what science is behind the plants. How do I know the energetics, affinities, and actions of a local herb that has very scant documentation? Are there particular characteristics that determine what qualities an herb must have to be qualified in a formulation, e.g. Sida acuta? How do I know it can also be used as a driver in a formulation, or if it can play that role? Yeah, this is a really, really good question here, and I think it touches on, there's a couple dynamics that this question touches on. First off is, how do we determine kind of some of these, like Western ways of understanding the properties of a plant, as noted there, things like herbal actions, organ system affinities, the energetics. How do we determine those things in plants that haven't been traditionally documented that way, or you can't exactly look them up right in a standard Western materia medica? And then also I like how your question is then bringing in the attribute of formulation into that. How do we know how to formulate with that plant? Well, I think there's a couple different ways of approaching this. One is, and I think one of the most ideal ways is, if you are able to find a person that has any of this traditional knowledge about how those local medicinal plants are used, I would absolutely encourage trying to find someone like that and ask them questions, see what they're willing to share. Obviously, you probably can't ask them well, what are the herbal actions, But I would say most herbalists are probably going to, at the very least, be able to tell you what organ system they go to, right? Or based on what they're traditionally used for, this is used for a cough. Okay, well, we know it's going to have a respiratory affinity. And then you can sometimes ask more clarifying questions. Oh, well, is it better if the cough is really dry or really wet? Oh, very good for a dry cough. Okay, well, that gives you a sense for some of the energetics, moistening, right? So you can infer some of these Western ways of kind of understanding a medicinal plant just based on a conversation. Even if they're not using that terminology, you can pretty quickly start translating it just based on how that plant has traditionally been used. So I think that's really, really valuable. Obviously, sometimes that's not, it's not easy to find, maybe someone that practices herbal medicine based on the traditional ways or using all those local plants and things like that. But I do think if you can, that's the best. From there, I think it comes down to your own experience with the plant and kind of starting from scratch in a way, right? And really working with that plant in the sense of engaging with it and tasting it and ingesting it. Obviously making sure, you know that it's a safe plant to work with. There's no major contraindications or, side effects or anything like that you need to be concerned about. But there is a really great value in experiencing a plant for yourself, and deciphering its medicinal virtues. And one of the best places to start with that is the taste. So the taste of a medicinal plant can give you a wealth of information about that plant. The taste of a plant can inform you of organ system and tissue affinities. The taste of a plant can inform you of its medicinal actions. The taste of a plant can inform you of its energetics. So you can infer a lot of those things simply just by an initial taste of the herb. So for example, bitter plants tend to always have an affinity for the liver, the gallbladder, and the digestive system. Bitter plants typically have a cooling energetic property. Bitter plants tend to be on the drying side of things. So bitter plants obviously have the action of being bitter tonic. Oftentimes they can be cholagogue and choleretic, meaning they increase bile production in the liver. That would be choleretic, and cholagogue, increasing bile secretions from the gallbladder. These are things that can simply just be inferred from that bitter taste. Now, obviously, each bitter plant is going to have its specificities and its nuances that really are learned from longer term usage of the plant. But you can, at the very least, start to infer some of these things just based on taste. Very pungent plants. Plants that have a lot of volatile oils and taste kind of spicy or peppery. Oftentimes these are plants that have a carminative action. Many times volatile oil or resinous plants have a expectorant property if you feel them in your lungs. More often than not, they tend to have a warming energetic. They tend to have a drying energetic. We see them in formulation, as your question is kind of geared towards formulation. Those pungent plants oftentimes are drivers. So you kind of mentioned the dynamic of how do you know if a plant can be used as a driver in formulation? Well, 99% of the time, drivers in herbal formulas are pungents, right? They're spicy, aromatic, warming, stimulating plants that will move the blood. So really with blood flow, there's kind of two ways I tend to think about it. There's the actual driving of blood, increasing blood flow through pungents, like I mentioned. And the classic ones here in Western herbalism would be things like cayenne pepper, ginger. Those two are really well-regarded drivers, especially cayenne's classic in traditional Western herbal medicine. The other is dilating blood vessels, right? So if you open up blood vessels, make them larger, right, you're going to bring more blood flow to that area. And so that's more in the realm of actually like antispasmodics or vasodilators. A big one in Western herbalism here is lobelia. This is where we see lobelia and cayenne being a major pair used in North American herbal medicine because lobelia dilates all the blood vessels, cayenne drives it, and this is how we equalize the circulation. So that's a pretty classic driver pair. The antispasmodics oftentimes will have an acrid taste, right? So plants that are acrid oftentimes are antispasmodic, oftentimes are nervine. They have an affinity for the muscles. They have an affinity for the nerves. And some will have different specificities, right? Where we see something like Dioscorea villosa or wild yam tends to have a little bit of a stronger affinity for the digestive system. Lobelia inflata, while it works everywhere, it does have a little bit of a stronger orientation towards the respiratory tract. Piper methysticum or kava kava definitely relaxes muscles everywhere, but tends to have a little bit more of a urinary tract affinity. And those are the kind of details that, again, you really infer from longer term usage of the plant to kind of see, okay, how is, if you're just working with a plant through your experience, you take it for a longer period of time and you just start to pay attention to your body. Oh, interesting. I'm, having to go to the bathroom more consistently, or, oh, my digestion has really changed, or, oh, I feel more calm and relaxed, things like that. So I think there's a dynamic of cultivating physiological and anatomical sensitivity that I think is a very important skill as herbalists, that you are able to develop a very kind of heightened and refined awareness of your body and how your body just feels naturally kind of when it's at baseline. And then when you start working with a medicinal plant, you can start to be aware of how that physiological baseline starts to shift. And I think this is just a really, really valuable skill. For example, with myself, like I've been really consciously working on that for a long time, so that when I take a plant, I can literally feel in my body where that plant is going. Like I can feel when something's working through my kidneys and my bladder. I can feel an herb when it's affecting my nervous system or my lungs, or, just through paying attention, just through kind of sensitizing your body to those sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle shifts that a plant can bring when you introduce it into your body. So the tastes are really, really important. I really like to focus on just to begin the main primary taste. If we're taking that from an Ayurvedic perspective or a Chinese perspective, there's 5. Ayurveda adds a 6th. So that would be bitter, pungent, sweet, salty, sour. And then Ayurveda adds a 6th, which would be astringent. And just by tasting those tastes, you can infer a lot. So just a real quick run through them, I kind of talked about bitter and I talked a bit about pungent. If we were to look at astringent, that tends to have a drying energetic on the tissues. It tends to affect the mucosa. They tend to be vulnerary, wound healing. They affect the skin. Oftentimes drying out the mucosa in the GI, in the urinary tract, in the respiratory tract, and tightening and toning. So they're typically used for a relaxed tissue state to bring more tensile strength and tone to those tissues. So that's a really useful thing to understand about astringents. The sour taste, there's varying opinions amongst traditions about the sour taste. Some say they're warming, some say they're cooling. One thing that we note in Western herbalism is that sour tasting plants tend to have a very strong effect on the cardiovascular system. They tend to be pretty cooling and antioxidant, reducing inflammation and heat and irritation. Right? This is where things like, why we drink lemonade on a hot summer day or eat berries, because they cool you off. Many of them are very flavonoid rich and sedative to heat. So that's a little bit on sour plants. That's where we see things like hawthorn berry, right? Really great for the heart and cardiovascular system. Elderberry would be in that category as well. The sweet taste tends to have a moistening energetic. It tends to build and strengthen tissues. It provides sustenance and strength. So we tend to use it more for dry, atrophic type tissue states. Sweet plants tend to be demulcent in action, so we'll see them moisten and hydrate tissues that are dry, cracked, weak, especially in the mucosa again. So the astringents tend to dry moisture in the mucosa. Sweet plants tend to bring moisture to the mucosa. So many times they will be moistening demulcent expectorant in the lungs. Sometimes some will be moistening demulcents as a diuretic in the urinary tract. Sometimes they will be moistening demulcents in the digestive system. Some do all, some are focused in other areas. So that taste is really useful to understand. The salty taste, a little nebulous for a lot of herbalists at first, because I think we're trained to think of salty as the taste of salt. But really the salty taste, according to Western herbalism, is really it's like a crispy minerally-ness. It's like the green, like if the color green had a flavor, right? That would be the salty taste. So the best examples of that I always think of is like horsetail and nettles are really good examples of the salty taste. Obviously things like kelp are pretty obviously salty, but I think horsetail and nettles are a really good example of a more subtle, subdued salty taste. These plants oftentimes are diuretic, working through the kidneys and urinary tract. Oftentimes they're very mineral-rich plants that help to just nourish and rebuild and sustain weakened tissues. So that's just a real quick run through of the 6 tastes. Obviously, there's a whole lot more that can be gone into in that. But to answer your question, I think that is the best place to start, right, is with your tastes. And from those tastes, you can start to infer what types of actions, what types of organ affinities, and what types of energetics you might start to see from those plants. And then from there, if you just work with that plant, say every day for 6 weeks, I think that's a really good amount of time to really start to get a sense for how that herb is altering or adjusting your physiological processes. And again, just cultivating a sensitivity to how that feels in your body. And, sometimes taking notes or having a little notebook to write down your experience can be really, really helpful. And also just, as I said earlier, paying attention. Sit down with your cup of tea and drink the tea of that herb and just really pay attention to your body and make note of what do you feel? Like, how does this feel? And that, coupled, of course, with any traditional knowledge that you can glean, can really help to start to put the pieces of the puzzle together so that you can start to decipher, how that herb is going to just be used medicinally, which will then guide how you're going to formulate with it as well. So I guess that would be the B, is how you would formulate with it. But you can't really know how to formulate with an herb until you understand really the core properties of that plant as it exists on its own. So you got to really start there, and then you can start to piece together how you might combine it with other plants to have a really nice synergistic effect. And then another part of your question, are there particular characteristics that determine what qualities an herb must have to be qualified in a formulation? I would say that really comes down to really knowing, again, the actions, the affinities, and the energetics. So, if you're working with a formula for the respiratory system, well, you want to know that the herbs that going into that formula obviously have an affinity for the lungs and maybe have an expectorant property. And then looking into, what's the tissue state of the person I'm treating? It's cold and it's damp. Okay, well, we want more warming, drying, stimulant expectorants as opposed to moistening, demulcent expectorants. So that's where you get a little bit more specific. And that's why when I'm really looking at a plant, I don't want to just know the energetics. I don't want to just know the affinities. I don't want to just know the actions. I really need to know all three and how they come together in a pattern that really informs me how to use that plant in an effective way. So yeah, really great question there. I hope I'm saying your name right, Titilayo. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, but hopefully that answers your question. It's a really great one. And thank you for asking it.